Assalamu alaikum and welcome. My name is Hannah Zaberi and I'm your host here at Justice for All Now. We're back after a little hiatus. We haven't been online for about a week, but we're back. You can always watch us 24/7 on Muslim Network TV, on Roku TV, Galaxy Satellite 19, Apple TV, and Amazon Fire TV. So today, our discussion topic is going to be India, and particularly the Delhi Pogram. Amnesty International has alleged that the Indian police committed serious human rights violations during deadly religious riots, as they call it, in Delhi earlier this year. It said police beat protesters, tortured detainees, and at times took part in riots with Hindu mobs. More than 40 people died, as the BBC has reported, when clashes broke out between Hindus and Muslims over a controversial citizenship law. Now, even this reporting of the BBC is problematic. We are going to be discussing a lot of what actually transpired in Delhi, why the program took place, what is happening between Hindus and Muslims in India, with my guest today. We're also going to be discussing the Indian judiciary system. So I'm really, really pleased to have with us Rajagopal. Raju has spent over 2 decades working with civil society groups in India and has been active on a range of issues such as rural development, disaster management, governance, and transparency. He's worked on communal harmony and human rights. He shares his time between Berkeley, California, and Chennai, India, and writes on social causes. Prior to engaging with the nonprofit sector, he spent over 3 decades in the corporate world, retiring as the chief operating officer of a publicly traded healthcare company in the United States. Raju is with Hindus for Human Rights. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Raju. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I'm really looking forward to learning from you and introducing you to our audience.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hannah, for having me in the show. And I hope I will be able to answer questions from you or from the audience and do my very best. Thank you.
That's great. One of the things that I really, a lot of times people don't, when we even type out Delhi Pogram, people don't understand what a pogram is. People don't know what actually transpired, why it's not fair to call it a religious riot. So, could you explain to us what happened in Delhi?
Yeah. What had happened is in the large scale protests that broke out after the announcement of the Discriminatory Citizenship Amendment Act. For the first time, there was a widespread and popular rebellion against that law, or protest against that law, which brought out the kinds of people that would normally will never be on the street. For example, Muslim women in Shaheen Bagh took a lead. Many of the groups rose in support of them in all over India. So the backdrop of that is unprecedented and widespread protests all over India, joined by all types of people, students, elderly people, and of all faiths. And I think that protest really, in my view, really scared the government that there was indeed going to be something that they would be unable to manage. So that is the backdrop of what had transpired, what ultimately became the Delhi Program. And I think what happened also is once the COVID scare came and many of these protesters continued to protest despite the risk to themselves, there was a lot of COVID related scare was then exploited by many people, especially of the ruling party, trying to portray the protesters as being irresponsible. not only for continuing their protests, as well as in some cases blocking the street, which in many cases were not true because the police themselves had blockaded some of the streets. So this is a kind of a general environment in which the programs were initiated, primarily when BJP politicians went on television, basically giving a deadline to the police,
Mhm.
saying, if you don't clear these protesters off the streets, we are going to take action on our own.
Mm.
It is my belief that it was a very well planned statement where things had already been put in place to bring in people from the outside into Muslim communities. And this was a kind of a last statement from the BJP politicians. And most people believe that was a clue, that was a signal for masses of right wing groups, vigilantes, often from outside, to come and attack, especially Muslim businesses and Muslim neighborhoods, while the police looked on. And even when that politician was making this statement about we're going to take things in our own hands, uh, senior police people were standing right next to him and didn't utter a word of protest, which was also taken by most people as a signal of acceptance of what BJP was doing. So that's the background
Mm.
as to how this all started. And unfortunately, the entire narrative and the cause of the programs are being completely reinvented, not only by the BJP politicians, but by the police today.
And what is happening now? We understand that several of the protesters were arrested, and the narrative. Like recently, there was a book that was going to be published by, I believe, Bloomsburg,
Yeah.
India. Could you talk about that? How the narrative change is taking place?
Yeah. Uh, During those 2 or 3 days of violence, I was at Berkeley,
Mhm.
but one of our representatives was in Delhi actually monitoring the helpline from people that were being attacked in real time.
Mhm.
And so, what was clear to us sitting here and for our people in Delhi was most of the victims, most of the people that were being attacked were indeed Muslims. Now, we also found that there were certain areas, in this I heard from one of the reporters themselves, where a particular area had been cordoned off, not only by the police, but by the Hindu right wingers. And I read later on found out that what was going on there was the beginning of a new narrative where they had video crews from a sympathetic TV station trying to make it appear that it were the Hindus who were the victims and Muslim the perpetrators. I
Mm.
didn't realize at that time what was all happening, but clearly that was the beginning of manufacturing evidence that somehow the Muslims were the perpetrators and many of the activists were supporting them. So what has happened since then is a continuous effort to redo the narrative, including the book that you referred to, which was fortunately withdrawn by the publisher,
Mhm.
basically saying this was an active conspiracy by several activists from JNU, Jamia, and other activists who hashed this conspiracy to take advantage of COVID and advantage of the CAA protests to push for attacking Hindu neighborhoods. And that narrative they're continuing to pursue. Now, what I know in what has happened recently is they are acting based on some very, very tenuous evidence. For example, one particular policeman of junior rank apparently told the police official that he heard a rumor that
Mm.
there was a WhatsApp conspiracy. And that became the source of a major investigation where they have looked through WhatsApp groups that were merely standing in support of the victims, and then they're trying to convert those WhatsApp conversation into a major conspiracy as
Mm.
if that group was responsible for the riots or pogroms rather than responding to the plea of the victims. And some of the people that were initially arrested apparently were part of this WhatsApp group. And based on the initial arrest and a statement that the police wanted these women to sign, pointing fingers at other activists, they have now been naming other activists. And just in the last 48 hours, JNU student Umar Khalid has been arrested,
Mhm.
and a filmmaker couple, Rahul Roy and Sabah, have been questioned even as late as yesterday, and there are fears that they may be arrested as well. And Professor Apurvanand, who is in Delhi University, has also been interrogated several times and has not been cleared by the police yet, and there is fear that he too may be arrested. All basically based on tenuous WhatsApp evidence and hearsay rather than going after the real perpetrators.
And what can be done to? Is there any possible way to stop these arrests? Can pressure be put on? What can as or do people just sit by and watch quietly?
Well, there are two ways to look at it. Apparently, in response to Umar Khalid's arrest, there is already a student movement gathering momentum
Mhm.
in India to respond to it. But given the current circumstances with COVID and a very unfriendly judiciary, unfriendly police, I'm not sure how far those kinds of resistance within India are going to go.
Mhm.
Uh, and I think the attempt of the government is basically to put people who have been leading these protests and have been inspiring in talking about nonviolence movements, to put them away so that any movement like the one that is apparently beginning will be somewhat leaderless or rudderless. I
Mm.
think that's the aim of the government. Uh, what we can do from the diaspora is to shine light as much as possible as to what is going on, get our lawmakers informed about what is going on, and start our own movement. For example, a group of NRIs who have come together under the title of Reclaiming India. We are
What
called
just for our audience? What are NRIs?
non-resident Indian groups, and we are Muslims, we are Hindus, we are secular groups, we are students. We have all come together to precisely take the our primary objective as amplifying the voices from India and showing our own resistance to what is happening in India, particularly these recent arrests. And we are planning to have a press conference probably on Thursday,
Mhm.
which we'll hope not only the diaspora organization, but as well as media from India will participate with a single message that we are here as diaspora Indians to show our support. And we will go the extra mile to make sure that we support anyone and everyone in India who are resisting what's going on right now.
Mm. So one of the things that the Amnesty report also pointed out was that not one single political leader who made hate speeches which advocated violence in the build-up to what transpired in Delhi has been prosecuted, and then it recommends an independent inquiry. So, can you tell us right now what is happening with Amnesty India itself, and is there any way for any of its recommendations to actually be carried out?
Um, what is happening to Amnesty India in recent weeks is they are being investigated by several state agencies. Their donors have been, or all Indian, by the way, their donors have been pretty much put on notice not to support the organization through various means. Their employees have been interviewed by these agencies, sometimes even basically telling them, why are you working for this organization? Uh, Basically putting the fear in the employees of Amnesty to leave the organization. And so much more has been happening in the last 48 hours that I am not able to share with this audience. But the bottom line is the Amnesty India could be put entirely out of business in the next 2 days with no ability to do anything. So, in effect, Amnesty's report on the Delhi programs as well as on Kashmir is really in all of our hands to follow through, whether it's in India or here, because Amnesty India itself may not be able to do much in the coming days. Uh, as far as their specific recommendations, um, obviously, the fact that we need to point out that the real perpetrators, despite enormity of video evidence, like, for example, politician Kapil Mishra, the fact that the police have not even interviewed them, let alone prosecute them, is something we need to focus on and shine light on with our own lawmakers. As far as an independent inquiry, I'm personally a skeptic of that, particularly in the current environment, because the only independent inquiry in India that has any clout, any impact, would be a Supreme Court uh, initiated inquiry. And in the current situation of where the Supreme Court is, I'm not sure that's going to happen. So while I agree that there is a urgent and crying need for an independent inquiry, I'm personally skeptical that something in the current Indian environment will work, and I doubt if Indian government will allow any outside agency to do any such inquiries.
So this is very troubling what you just said, right? Because one of the things that we consistently hear, as you know, all of us move in the circles within, even just on Congress, on the Hill, or if we're talking to the State Department, any of the hearings that have been held on even Kashmir, one of the things that the State Department consistently says that they believe in the strength of the Indian judiciary. They believe that what is transpiring can be overcome because of the strength of the courts. So when and I would like you to please share with us why this is troubling. Why would you make that statement? And what trends have you seen in the Indian judiciary that make you troubled?
Yeah. Um, if 5 years ago, if somebody had asked me which is one of the strongest pillars of Indian democracy, or what are some of the strongest pillars, I would have pointed to three pillars.
Mm-hmm.
One is the Election Commission. Second would have been the National Human Rights Commission. And third would have been the Supreme Court of India, which has had a stellar reputation for, even in the past, of even taking a postcard to take suo motu notice of a citizen's complaint.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps many people are still living in that past, believing in the credibility of the Indian judiciary. But in my view, things have come down crumbling in the last few years. And I'll give you some examples. Obviously, you've seen what happened in 2002 in Gujarat, of course, where it took such enormous personal sacrifices on the part of individual NGOs to bring even a handful of cases to trial, with a very antagonistic judiciary in Gujarat at that time. And in fact, one successful case had to be moved to Mumbai, which had a better judiciary and which was the only one that came out with a clear case in a case of a rape, uh, coming up with a judgment that was really laudable. That was in 2002 to 2006. Now, that Gujarat judiciary attitude, unfortunately, is now much more prevalent all over India. I'm not much into the lower courts. I can't talk with any authority with them, other than the fact that even yesterday, I think Harsh Mandar wrote an article quoting one of the judges in a lower court. And I think it's the Delhi High Court. I may be mistaken, taking to task one of the protesters that was applying for bail, basically saying something to the effect that if you play with the embers, you shouldn't be complaining about the winds that started the fire. these kinds of statements, which completely are contrary to the right of a citizen to protest and to seek justice and to disagree with the government, is enormously troubling. And
Mm.
if it indeed came from a high court judge, that would be even more troublesome. I'm just giving you one example. But going to the Supreme Court, I remember even as late as about a year and a half, 2 years ago, under another chief justice, there were several rulings. One on the LGBT community, uh, about transgender rights. Once on the right of women to enter Shabarimala.
Mhm.
Several judgments that were applauded by human rights activists in India, saying, "Wow, these are good examples," and people are all looking at Justice Chandrachud as a really uh, looking to some of his support for these kinds of things. And then suddenly things seem to have changed. And the Ayodhya judgment was, in my view, one of the things that I still today don't understand. How a Supreme Court can say, on the one hand, yes, it was a criminal act to destroy Babri Masjid in 1992. However, we are making the decision today to hand over the property to Hindu groups to build a grand Ram temple. So to me, it sounded like, as a non-legal professional and simply an activist, it looked like somebody was telling me, "Yeah, yeah, we know your home was destroyed. Too bad. But while we are looking into it, we found some errors in your land record, so we're going to hand over your property to somebody else to build a house. But we will deal with the violence later on." And that kind of judgment from the Supreme Court has really significantly lowered its credibility among not just the minorities, among many people. Second thing is about yeah, you want me to stop here, Hannah? You have.
Yes, I wanted to ask you. I was looking at your Twitter handle, and you have a stand with Prashant Bhushan hashtag going on for Hindus for Human Rights. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about this, because this is very uh, important part of this, the changes that are happening in India, especially when it comes to the Supreme Court and the judiciary. So could you explain to us what this movement was about, what this campaign was about?
Yeah. For those of you that may not be aware, Prashant Bhushan has been a Supreme Court lawyer for decades and is well known for many of his public interest litigation on behalf of the poor and marginalized. Uh, One example that you might be interested, this is just to give you a background on the kinds of things Prashant Bhushan has been doing in the Supreme Court, uh, was his working with activists in Karnataka to expose a massive mining scam in Dharwad and Bellary area. And as a result of his effort with local activists, that scam was exposed, which halted a significant source of income for politicians, and also resulted in the court recognizing that area as a deeply environmentally affected area where there may, in fact, be some sort of a judgment allocating a lot of funds to rebuild the environment in that area and to rebuild other employment for the people in that area. So that's just one example. Currently, it's still going on. Now, this Prashant Bhushan has also been very active in looking at the justice system and the judicial system, and is often taken uh, the courts to task for alleged corruption and some of their judgments, which is his right as a citizen to question. He has never ever questioned the sanctity of the courts. However, he has, been very outspoken in questioning some of the judgments and some of the corruption cases. Now, what happened in recent times is, after COVID, when the Supreme Court practically reduced their volume of work and pushed away a lot of very important cases that one would have expected the Supreme Court to discuss.
Mhm.
The lockdown in Kashmir, uh, challenges to the Citizenship Amendment Act, and many other such important issues that were affecting the day to day lives of people, they were all put on the back burner. And instead, the Supreme Court took it upon itself to question Prashant Bhushan and hold him in contempt for a couple of tweets. And one such tweet was the Chief Justice, who had an Instagram message that he sent out, sitting on a very sophisticated motorbike with no mask and people surrounding him. And Prashant had tweeted that and said, "It is very odd to see a Supreme Court justice in this position when the rest of the country is suffering, not only from COVID, but by lack of attention by the Supreme Court."
Mhm.
So this was one of the tweets that the court felt that he was insulting the sanctity of the Supreme Court, and they brought him to trial and found him in contempt. And after a lot of protests, including ours, against this kind of a judgment, they finally fined him 1 rupee. And if he didn't pay 1 rupee, that he could be disbarred for 3 years
Yeah.
and suspended for and get a jail sentence for 6 months. And tomorrow, or actually today, September 15th, is the deadline for that 1 rupee fine. And many villagers in Karnataka are offering 1 rupee to him today to show their thanks to his work.
Yeah.
So this is the case of Prashant Bhushan. It is not just about Prashant Bhushan. It is about so many active lawyers who've been fighting the cases for the poor, and how the Supreme Court chose to ignore all of that and instead focus on themselves as if they had been violated, is the story today.
And don't you need to be in court to be in contempt of court? I'm not a lawyer, so but that sort of comes up in discussions. But this is what you have described so far has been, and honestly, I can share this with you, coming from a granddaughter of two Indian lawyers. Both my grandfathers were lawyer attorneys in India, and to see the downslide of what that court used to be and what it is now, it is and I mean, and I feel like this is happening across the world, even here in the United States, right? It's happening everywhere. When fascism creeps up, this the courts are the ones that suffer, and are one of those that the roots keep are being chopped off of that. So this is, how does a layperson, how does a person who's concerned about this in India or in the United States, what can we do about this? What can we do to make sure that it, because it seems like such a vast problem.
Yeah, I one thing we have to do is, as you pointed out earlier, is to provide the latest information to people in this country who are still belaboring under the impression that India is one of the best judicial systems in the world, our India Supreme Court. First, we need to disabuse people of that notion with all due respect and say that things have been sliding fast. This is what is happening. Here are some examples. And I am working on one such document that could be shared even with Congress people. And lawyers understand the language much better. And many of our Congress people are also have studied law. So that could be one thing that we could be doing. This is one of the conversations I had with Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy 3 days back, and he said it would be very useful to have such a document. And as a person seen as a supporter of the Modi government, I think I would like to start there and convince him that things are not as he may think they are, and move on to other lawmakers. That's one thing we can do. As far as India is concerned, I don't know what the plan is. One of the retired Supreme Court justices, whose name I won't mention, told us in a webinar that he hopes that all the current and past Supreme Court lawyers and High Court lawyers will band together and create some sort of a document that would, from their perspective, put the Supreme Court in the spotlight. I don't know if that'll happen, I don't know what the risks they may face in doing something like that. But what that would do is convince the ordinary person in India, who is not hearing a whole lot from the legal community for whatever reason. If they hear a combined voice of the legal community as to what they're seeing, that might really open the eyes of the ordinary person. Now, I don't mean to be speaking up for someone like Prashant, who continues to have confidence in the long run,
Mhm.
continues to have confidence in India's judicial system. But obviously, his confidence comes with a number of caveats, and those caveats involve the ordinary citizen of India in supporting that he is not misplaced in his confidence. And what is it that we can do? So we're going to have a panel on September 4th with Prashant Bhushan, with um, Jai Singh, I forget her first name, my apologies,
Mhm.
who defended him, one of the most senior, most lawyers in the Supreme Court. It would be a place for, if anybody is interested in asking them, what are some of the things that the lawyers and the judicial system in India can do? We're going to have a taping of that particular panel, and if anybody is interested, they can send me a mail, and I would be happy to include them in the audience for that, so they can ask questions themselves.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. I wanted to now talk a bit about Hindus for Human Rights. The formation of the organization, the work that is being done, and particularly, I've had these discussions with some of your colleagues as well. How, um, what was the need to start this organization? I mean, obviously, we've been discussing the needs, but what was the fire behind
Yeah,
the actual launch?
good question.
Mhm.
Uh, Let me speak from a personal perspective. I think I've told you before, told that in our earlier conversations, my activism in India began with 1992, with the demolition of the Babri Masjid, and then much more after the 2002 Gujarat pogroms.
Mhm.
And I continued on for several years, writing about it, helping the victims in Gujarat. I still continue to have contacts with people that are affected by the Gujarat pogroms. But all this while, I always thought of myself Indian being my primary identity,
Mhm.
Indian American being my second identity, and I was fighting for the human rights of all people
Mhm.
as an Indian. But as I have seen the progress of the BJP and the RSS since the Gujarat pogroms, when they declared that Gujarat was merely a laboratory for what they would do in the rest of the country, which many people laughed off
Mhm.
because they had so much confidence in the goodness of India's electorate that they thought that what happened in Gujarat could never happen anywhere. But what I have seen systematically is the vacuum that we as Hindus, whether we consider ourselves to be Orthodox Hindus or progressive Hindus or secular Hindus, the space that we have left a vacuum in for not speaking up as Hindus
Mhm.
has been completely taken over by political Hindutva, which claims to speak for all of us. And we can continue to work as leftist groups, secular groups, or whatever, but I feel we will never be able to have any impact on that space that's been taken over. So we made the decision consciously a year ago, or 2019, when Modi got re-elected. Some of us who had not known each other before,
Mhm.
but who seem to have made the same journey, that it's time for us to speak up as Hindus, not in a religious sense, not to create any new Hinduism or anything like
Mhm.
that, but to re-exert our Hindu-ness, to say that what is happening today in our names is not the kind of Hinduism that we grew up in. But what we stand for is the same thing as amnesty may stand for, as what justice for all may stand for. But what we do, what we bring extra to the table is to speak as Hindus, and which in fact has opened up a lot of space for us
Mhm.
which would not be otherwise available to us in interfaith dialogues, in international religious freedom roundtables. In so many ways, us speaking as Hindus has opened up many more opportunities for us to make an impact. And that's what we are hoping to do. Whether more and more Hindus will join, it's our work that's going to show
Mhm.
results over time.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you, because there's a great burden and guilt. I know this as a Muslim activist. Anytime something happens, I don't know, in Syria, uh, I feel like I have to be up on a podium responding to that. And after years of doing that, you sort of become so tired of it. And you're like, no, I have nothing to do with these people. They have hijacked my religion, and I do not want to speak for them. Yet at the same time, I resent the term, for example, Islamist, when that is used, because I feel like it is taking my faith that teaches me peace and justice, and it to do good to others, submission to God, and taken that and put it, made it this political weapon. And I would hate for the Hindu community to go through the same what we have gone through for decades. Um, this word Hindutva, does that bother you as a practicing Hindu?
No, the term doesn't bother me. I'll explain why.
Okay.
Uh, Unlike people calling them extremists, Hindu fanatics, Hindu right wing, all of those are, in my view, in some way or other, judgmental, just like you talked about Islamists. Whereas Hindutva is a self description of a train of thought of 90 years ago.
Mm.
Self definite. Hindutva simply means Hinduness. What's wrong with that, right?
Right.
But if you attach how it was described by its founder, the man who created,
Mm.
it tells you that Hindutva cannot exist on its own without hatred for the minorities. And it's very clearly documented in their own words, not mine, that and being against Islam, being against Christianity is the very essence of Hindutva as defined by its founders.
Mm.
So I find nothing wrong in using that term, but I'm sure some of my fellow Hindus are probably bothered by it because they haven't bothered to look at its roots.
Mm.
So today I would rather use the word Hindutva because I can defend it. It's not an insulting term. It is simply a historical term to describe what we now have in Delhi. And I would rather, what bothers me on the other hand, is when people, even on the left, criticizing me for saying, oh, what is wrong in using the word Hindu Rashtra?
Mm.
You're legitimizing something that is really, in fact, a Hindutva Rashtra. Hindu Rashtra is not something, even if there were one, I would define it very differently based on my understanding of Hinduism. But Hindutva Rashtra is much more appropriate because it is the very thing that Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Home Minister Amit Shah and many others are striving to build. It has nothing to do with religion. It
Mm.
is a political formulation called Hindutva, and what they're trying to build is a Hindutva Rashtra and then trying to co opt religion into it, which is what my fellow Hindus have to resist. And that is the work cut out for us. I don't
Mm.
know if that answers your question.
It does, but it also begets another question. So, if a lot of the strings that are being pulled by the upper echelon, the elite of Hindu society, the Brahmins.
Yeah.
The rest of the under the caste system, the rest of the Hindus are sort of being pulled along and being told what to do. And the people benefiting perhaps are only that elite echelon. So would it not be fair to call that out, the Brahmins out for this? And this, I'm with deepest respects to the faith, and I hope I'm not asking a politically incorrect or an insensitive question, but this is something that I've wanted to ask somebody who is a practicing Hindu, and wanted to get your perspective on
Yeah, it's a good question. To give you an honest answer to it, Hannah, it's a work in process for me.
that. Hmm.
It's a work in process only because um, upper uh, caste or Suvarna, as is normally described these days, they have the privilege of denying the caste system only because they haven't had to deal with it.
Hmm.
And that is the background that I grew up in most of my life. As a born in a Brahmin family, going to an elite institution where everybody around me came from similar backgrounds. So some of them even today saying, "What are you talking about, Raju? We never encountered the caste system. Aren't you exaggerating what's happening?" And that's very easy to do when you are in a privileged background, and it's like somebody in Idaho talking about what is all this nonsense about racism. We've never seen it. And I have a good friend in California who is an African American. That kind of
Hmm.
logic. So it's a work in process for me. Having said that, I don't. Yes, Brahmanism and Brahmins have to be called out, and that is something that I'm still, as I said, working on. But I don't think you should also discount the possibility and the reality that over the years, some of the upper caste, but not necessarily Brahmins, the business groups, the business elite,
Hmm.
what we would call as Vaishyas or whatever other terms that we use, or perhaps financially the biggest supporters of Hindutva. So
Hmm.
you can't just say, somehow the Brahmins are just pulling the string anymore, and Modi certainly isn't one. So it would be, if we want to honestly analyze it, I think just using that formulation of Brahmanism, get rid of Brahmins, everything will be all right, I think is somewhat misplaced. We should not discount it, given its history, given the history that most of the RSS people have been Brahmins.
Hmm.
But I think to be more realistic about today's world as to where is all this money coming from to support candidates both in India and here, I wouldn't be surprised if significant part of it come from non-Brahmin communities who are bought into this idea of a Hindu Rashtra.
I understand. And you write about this. You've written in the scroll, um, where you say, where you're calling out American born members of the Hindu nationalist organizations such as HSS and Hindu American Foundation and the Hindu Student Council. Do they not know the ideological roots of their own organizations? Do they not see the dichotomy between their lives here as a religious minority in a welcoming multi ethnic democracy versus their organizations' active support for the religious bigotry of the Bharatiya Janata Party in India? You go on to say, do they not understand that the BJP and RSS are now working assiduously to bring about Savarkar's dream of a Hindu majority state where Muslims and Christians would be at best second class citizens? Do our young Hindu lawmakers in the US Congress not see the moral chasm between their passion to defeat Trump for his mockery of our Constitution versus their acquiescence to the Modi Shah rule in India, where it has already begun to dismantle India's once celebrated secular constitution? So, what reaction did you get from that piece?
Uh, multiple reactions. One, I think, is to challenge the notion that the minorities are under threat.
Mm.
And it goes into defending CAA as a completely harmless piece of legislation to bring people that are persecuted in neighboring countries. And it has nothing to do with Muslims in India. Even some of my relatives believe that because that is the party line. Uh, so they see that line of argument that I have made as not based on fact in their mind, because
Mm.
they believe that, oh, we've been a welcoming country, As Hindus, we're not going to turn away 200 million Muslims. Maybe some couple of politicians may be saying such things in bombast, but it's not going to happen. But so that's one line of argument we get. And my counter to that is, let's look at the chronology of the CAA, when it was initiated, what was the statements of Shah after the Assam NRC, where he pretty much told the 2 million people that were not on NRC that if they were Hindus or, if they were non-Muslim, they could apply for citizenship. But if you're Muslims, you could, you're on your own.
Mhm.
So that had nothing whatsoever to do with asylum. So these are the things we have to educate people on. That number one reaction. The second reaction would be, my rhetorical question: don't these organizations not know that they're supporting a majoritarian Hindu state? I think they know.
Mhm.
It is a willful action on their part to support it. And they're even teaching their children in the RSS shakas all over the US what RSS people have learned in the shakas for 90 years in India. So the answer to that rhetorical question is obvious, yes.
Mhm.
But they have this idea, but they have a very sophisticated strategy to portray themselves here to the lawmakers, to their constituencies and others, that they're a Hindu group who must be treated on par with Jewish groups and Muslim groups, and they want to do well for their constituent. They will go and celebrate with the police people in certain constituencies. So they've done their work basically to be seen as a ethnic religious minority that wants to be a model minority. But
Mm.
little do most people know that they do not represent a model minority if you peel the onion, so to speak, and see what they stand for.
So, and this is, you have answered some questions that our audience is asking. How do we explain the fact that American Hindus who belong to Hindu groups oppose white nationalism and support for pluralism here in the US, but support the BJP, which is based on Hindu superiority? How do we get them to see how hypocritical this is? And
Yeah.
that's the struggle, is that if you can only show a mirror to somebody who wants to look into the mirror. But just as we've seen in in work with, for example, you know the Israel Palestine movement, the struggle against occupation there, is that it wasn't until the young Jews in this country started realizing it themselves what is going on. And that really gives me a lot of hope when I see organizations like Students Against Hindutva, led by young Hindus, who realize that this dichotomy cannot play out, and only they can change the minds of people in their own communities, in their own homes, in their own temples. Another question that I believe Farhana has had is, and this is, she talks, and she's a lawyer, she's talking about the judiciary. Does the Indian Supreme Court still enjoy the same esteem and legitimacy amongst constituents, constitutional scholars, giving their validation of Modi's pernicious initiatives? I'd like you to answer that question.
Yeah, I, I haven't done any systematic study of what people across the world are thinking, but I can tell you, as I said, you cannot, in my view, I would not hold the Supreme Court in esteem based on their latest decisions, with no hope for taking on some of the issues. For example, the 7 million Kashmiris who have been locked up, and the 200 million Muslims in India whose future has been kind of put with a question mark, which is even more troubling to me than actually implementing the CAA.
Mm.
If every child born into a Muslim family is beginning to answer, wow, do I belong here? When is my turn going to come to be expelled? That is being in a constant state of anxiety. So I don't know. And if the Supreme Court is refusing to acknowledge that this reality, I don't know if they have the same esteem as they were previously held in. Uh, so that's the best way I can answer. But I just wanted to add to your comment about the younger people, Hena. And that is really the our hope too. That Students Against Hindutva Ideology, which started as a small group in AL, is now present in 20 campuses, and they do not mince any words about this kind of hypocrisy of the Indian American community. And they want them to hold India to the same standards as we hold the American government to. And I think all of the older people like me doing our work, hopefully we can really encourage the younger Indian Americans to come out and support a new Indian American community as we move forward.
So,
And there will, I'm sorry. There will be two panels on the October 3rd and 4th, one led by the younger group from Students Against Hindutva Ideology, and another group which is going to bring in the JNU and Jamia, the two of the women who have been in the news a lot since those. They will be appearing on a panel as well. So two panels focused exclusively on younger people, both in India and here.
that's great. It will be very interesting, not just to watch the panels, but also the connections that are being made across oceans with not only the youth, but connecting the diaspora back to India, and which is super important. And this is the work that you guys are doing at Hindus for Human Rights. Well, we're at the end of our time, so thank you so much for being here, for being a part of the show, and just for the work that you do, Raju. Please go support their work at Hindus for Human Rights and join the conference on October 4th, and we'll keep you updated. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Salam alaikum. As we wrap up the show, I want to remind everybody that the petition to stop Disney is live on stopgenocide.org. Please go sign the petition. Disney is complicit in this genocide. They filmed right there around 10 concentration camps in East Turkestan, and have thanked the Turpan Public Security Bureau, which was outlawed by the United States government in October of 2019. So please do go sign that petition at stopgenocide.org/boycott Mulan. Salam alaikum.